They locked your accounts. I'm sorry, what do you mean locked? Marcus asked, keeping his voice calm and controlled, not raising it, not reacting in a way that would draw attention, even though the moment already had weight to it. The bank teller glanced at her screen again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard like she was deciding whether to type something else or leave it as it was. There's a hold on your account, she said, her tone polite but distant, like she was reading from something rather than explaining it. You won't be able to access your funds right now? Marcus nodded slowly, not because he accepted the answer, but because he understood what kind of moment this was becoming. What kind of hold? He asked. The teller hesitated briefly, then looked back at the screen. It doesn't specify here, she replied. It just says restricted. Marcus leaned slightly forward, not aggressively, just enough to make sure he was fully engaged in the conversation. I was here last week, he said. Everything was fine. Behind him, another customer stepped up to a different counter, placed a card down, and within seconds was greeted with a smile and a simple, "How can I help you today?" The rhythm of that interaction was quick, natural, and uninterrupted. The difference wasn't loud, but it was there. I understand, the teller said, her tone unchanged. But I can't override this. Marcus glanced briefly to the side, watching as the other customer was already being handed cash, the transaction completed without hesitation. Then he looked back at her. I need to withdraw money today, he said. This isn't optional. The teller gave a small, practiced nod, the kind that acknowledged the words without changing the outcome. I can call my manager, she said. Marcus nodded once. Please do. She picked up the phone, speaking quietly, her voice low enough that the details didn't carry, but her posture set enough. She glanced at Marcus once, then back at the screen, then away again, like she was describing something that needed more explanation than it should have. Marcus stood there, his hands resting lightly on the counter, his expression steady. Around him, the bank continued its normal flow. Customers came in, transactions happened, money moved, and every few seconds, someone walked away satisfied. Except him. A few moments later, a man in a dark suit approached, adjusting his jacket as he stepped behind the counter. His expression was professional, composed, but focused in a way that suggested he had already been briefed. Good afternoon, the manager said, looking directly at Marcus. I understand there's an issue with your account. Marcus met his gaze calmly. I'm being told it's locked, he said. I'd like to understand why. The manager nodded slightly, then turned to the screen, reviewing the account details quickly. His eyes moved across the information, pausing briefly, then continuing, his expression tightening just enough for Marcus to notice. It appears there's a restriction placed on your account, he said. Marcus didn't move. For what reason? He asked. The manager hesitated just for a second, then leaned slightly closer to the screen, typing something in, digging deeper. I'm trying to confirm that now, he replied. Behind Marcus, a woman laughed as she thanked the teller, tucking cash into her purse before walking away. Another customer was already stepping forward, greeted with the same easy smile, the same smooth process. Marcus heard all of it. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. I have bills due today, Marcus said, his voice still calm, but firmer now. I need access to my own money. The manager nodded again, slower this time, like he understood the urgency, but wasn't yet ready to change the situation. Let me check something, he said. He typed again, his focus narrowing, his posture shifting from general professionalism to something more deliberate. A few seconds passed, then a few more, and the silence between them grew heavier. Finally, the manager leaned back slightly, his expression different now, not confused, but more aware. This hold shouldn't be here, he said quietly. Marcus held his gaze. But it is, he replied. The manager nodded once. Yes, he said. That moment changed the air between them, because now it wasn't about whether the account was locked. It was about why it had been locked at all. I'm going to need to verify some information, the manager said. Marcus didn't react immediately. What kind of information? He asked. Just standard verification, the manager replied. Marcus glanced briefly at the other counters again, watching another customer complete a transaction in under a minute. No additional steps, no extra questions. Standard for everyone, Marcus asked. The manager paused, because that question mattered. Yes, he said, but the hesitation before it was enough. Marcus reached into his wallet and placed his ID on the counter, then his bank card beside it. "Go ahead," he said. The manager picked them up, examining them carefully, comparing details, entering information into the system. His movements were precise, controlled, but slower than necessary, like he was making absolutely sure of something that didn't require that level of doubt. Seconds turned into minutes again. The bank continued moving around them, unchanged. Finally, the manager stopped typing. He looked at the screen, then at Marcus, then back at the screen again. "This is an internal error," he said. Marcus didn't respond right away. He just waited. "Your account was flagged incorrectly," the manager continued. "It shouldn't have been restricted." Marcus let that sit for a moment before speaking. "But it was," he said. The manager nodded. "Yes, and I'm the only one here dealing with it," Marcus added. Another pause, because again, there was nothing to argue with. The manager straightened slightly. "I'm going to remove the hold right now," he said. Marcus nodded once. "I'd appreciate that." The manager typed quickly now, his confidence returning as the situation became clearer, as if the uncertainty from before had been replaced with something easier to fix now that it was understood. A few seconds later, he looked up. "You should be able to access your funds now," he said. Marcus didn't move immediately. "Let's confirm," he replied. The manager nodded and signaled to the teller. She processed the transaction again, her fingers moving faster this time, her expression slightly more focused. Within seconds, the screen changed. "Approved," she said. The word landed differently than it should have, because it shouldn't have taken this long to get there. Marcus requested the amount he needed, and this time, there was no hesitation. The teller counted the cash carefully, placed it on the counter, and slid it toward him. "Here you go," she said. Marcus picked it up, holding it for a second before placing it into his wallet. He looked at the manager again, his expression calm, unchanged. "Thank you," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "But this shouldn't have happened." The manager didn't respond immediately, because again, there was nothing to argue with. Marcus turned and walked toward the exit, the bank doors opening automatically as he approached, letting in a brief rush of outside air before closing behind him again. Out on the street, everything felt normal. Cars passing, people walking, life moving. But the moment stayed with him, not because of how it ended, but because of how it started. Because sometimes the difference between smooth and complicated isn't about the system at all. It's about how quickly someone decides something before all the information is even checked. And once you've noticed that pattern clearly, you don't really stop noticing it. Marcus stepped down onto the sidewalk with the envelope of cash secured in his wallet, the glass doors of the bank closing quietly behind him as if nothing unusual had just happened inside. The street looked the same as it had when he walked in, people moving with purpose, conversations blending into the background, traffic flowing steadily through the intersection. And for a moment it felt like the world had stayed completely unaffected by the difference he had just experienced. He stood there for a second, not frozen, not unsure, just taking in the contrast between how simple the outcome was and how complicated the process had been to reach it. He adjusted his jacket slightly and began walking down the street, his pace steady, his expression calm, but his mind still turning over the details. It wasn't about the money anymore, because he had what he needed now. The transaction was complete. The system had corrected itself. But what stayed with him was everything that had happened before that point. The delay, the hesitation, the additional steps that no one else seemed to go through while he stood at that counter. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was clear enough that he didn't have to question whether it had happened or not. As he reached the corner, he stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. A group of people stood nearby, talking casually, one of them laughing at something on their phone, completely unaware of anything outside their own moment. Marcus glanced at them briefly, then back at the traffic, his thoughts settling into something quieter, more focused. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't trying to hold on to frustration, but he wasn't ignoring it either, because ignoring it would mean pretending it didn't matter. The light changed, and he stepped forward with the others, crossing the street in a steady flow of movement. On the other side, a small cafe sat on the corner, its windows reflecting the late afternoon light. People inside sitting with coffee cups, conversations happening in low tones. Marcus pushed the door open and stepped inside, not because he needed anything in particular, but because he wanted a moment to sit somewhere that wasn't moving as fast as the street outside. He ordered a coffee, his voice calm and normal, the interaction simple and easy, the barista smiling without hesitation, handing him the cup within seconds. Marcus noticed that too, not because it was unusual, but because it was exactly how things were supposed to work when nothing interrupted the process. He thanked her and moved to a table near the window, sitting down and placing the cup in front of him, his hands resting lightly on either side of it. For a few minutes, he just sat there, watching people pass by outside, letting the quiet of the cafe settle around him, the warmth of the coffee, the low hum of conversation, the soft music playing in the background. It all created a space that felt steady, predictable, uncomplicated, and in that space, the earlier moment became clearer, not because he was trying to analyze it deeply, but because it stood out naturally against everything else that worked without question. He took a sip of the coffee, then leaned back slightly, his eyes still on the window. The pattern wasn't something he had to search for anymore. It showed itself in contrast, in how one situation required extra steps while another moved smoothly without interruption. It wasn't always obvious, and it wasn't always easy to explain, but it was consistent enough that once you recognized it, you couldn't ignore it. After finishing his coffee, Marcus stood up and left the cafe, stepping back out onto the street where the pace of the city continued without pause. He walked toward his car, unlocking it and sitting inside, placing his wallet on the passenger seat for a moment before starting the engine. The familiar sound of the car starting brought a different kind of quiet, one that was contained, personal, separate from everything outside. As he drove, the city moved around him in a steady rhythm, traffic lights changing, cars stopping and starting, pedestrians crossing, everything following its own pattern. Marcus followed that flow, his hands steady on the wheel, his focus on the road, but his awareness still present in the background. The day had started like any other, simple, predictable, but it had shifted into something that stayed with him not because it was dramatic, but because it was subtle in a way that made it harder to dismiss. He reached his neighborhood as the sun began to lower, the lights softening across the buildings, casting longer shadows on the streets. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment before stepping out. The quiet of the area felt different from the city, slower, more contained, the kind of place where everything felt familiar. Marcus walked to his front door, unlocked it, and stepped inside, setting his keys down on the table as he moved further into the room. The space was calm, unchanged, a reminder that not everything carried the same weight as what had happened earlier. He placed the envelope of cash in a drawer, closing it gently, the task complete, the reason for his trip finished, but the awareness remained. He sat down on the couch, leaning back slightly, his gaze settling somewhere in the middle distance, not focused on anything specific, just present. It wasn't about replaying the moment over and over. It was about understanding it in a way that didn't need repetition. The difference had been clear, not exaggerated, not imagined, just there in the way things unfolded. And as he sat there in the quiet, one thought stayed with him more than anything else. The system worked, but not always the same way for everyone. And sometimes the difference isn't in the outcome, it's in the path you have to take to get there. And once you've seen that path clearly, even just once, you carry that awareness with you, not as something heavy, but as something real, something that shapes how you understand the next moment before it even begins.